Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Getty Museum, to this panel discussion. You are in for a treat tonight, and it's so gratifying to see so many people turned out. It is proof that alchemy lives, that you are all here. It is my very great pleasure, well, I should introduce myself. I'm Nancy Turner, the conservator of the manuscripts collection at the Getty Museum, and I curated a small show, the Alchemy of Color in Medieval Manuscripts, on view in the North Pavilion in the museum. And that show is made to go concurrently and to be a tiny adjunct to David Brafman's fabulous, huge, wide-ranging show from Egypt to the Enlightenment called The Art of Alchemy, that's at the Getty Research Institute. And I hope that you, if you haven't seen those shows already, that you do make time to see them both, because this is a moment that won't be repeated, I dare say. So tonight you are in for a real treat, because as part of our programming, we've asked two incredibly talented and well-renowned book artists to come to the Getty. This is the first such event of its kind. Both Dan Kelm and Tim Ely have come from far and wide to describe to all of us their incomparable work. I'm not sure if that's a picture of Dan and Tim, as they have been collaborators in the past, but they both work with the ideas and inspiration of alchemy in their book art, and it makes their works resonate. We've had this is a word that has kept coming up over the last day and a half. Tim's given us a fabulous workshop over the last day and a half, and Dan will be giving a workshop tomorrow, so if you'd like to come back at 1 o'clock in the studios A and B, he will be talking about gold. And I want to just say, part of this, the workshop, words that came up repeatedly were veils assembled. He talked about the Vedic square, obfuscation upon obfuscation, the book of changes, felt sensation, all of these intonations of meaning made with marks on the page. And I would say that they're both definitely shamans in their own right. So they will be presenting each of their respective works, and the panel will be joined by Marcia Reed, who is the Associate Director of the Getty Research Institute and Head of Special Collections as well as exhibitions at the Getty Research Institute, and Chief Curator. I think she's got like 3 titles. But Marcia is one of the Getty incomparables. She has been here for, probably she's been here longer than maybe a little longer than you've known Dan and Tim, but she's the founding curator of the Artist's Book Collection at the Getty Research Institute, which is a phenomenal resource that's been built quietly, literally over decades. And in fact, the Research Institute owns books by both Dan and Tim. So there isn't anyone else who is more qualified to be part of this evening tonight. And I'm thrilled that Marcia's able to participate in this panel because she's on a plane early tomorrow morning. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Marcia, who will introduce Dan and Tim in their turn. Thank you.
So hi there. We've been having these amazing days with Tim Ely and with a number of you artists who are in the audience. It's been so much fun to see Tim sharing some of his secrets and techniques. I'm thinking of these late Renaissance books of secrets, and then see some of you working out what you want to do with them. So it's been really great. I'm not an artist myself. I like to straighten pictures. And so it's been really terrific. And both Tim and Dan, and then there are a few other bookmakers in the audience as well, are well known for their books, and they have these characteristic modes they work in. When you see Tim Ely's books, you know what they are. When I pick up a book that's a Dan Kelm book, I can tell. I look for the wires, or I look for something else that's a telltale sign. Tim Ely has been here for a day and a half, sharing some of his techniques, but the lore is that he's been making books for 60 years. That's incredible. So he started in 1957, so we have a big anniversary coming up. He made a little cookbook for his mother and his friends quite a while ago. Does it still exist? Yes? Unsurprisingly, because he was a little boy at one time, his early interests were in UFOs, comics, but also alchemy. He went to art school in Western Washington University. He has an MFA from the University of Washington. But increasingly, at least since the 70s, he's been known for these signature books that he makes. He has done editions. We have, at the GRI, we have Synesthesia, which he did with, I don't know what you would call Terence McKenna, ethnobotanism, something. And it's a very beautiful book, done in many copies, but more character. Oh, and also he did an edition with Chronicle books as well, The Flight into Egypt. But his way of making books is actually the one of the kind and the unique. And it really is, the art is the books. And that's kind of a definition of artist books. The art is the books. And so his volumes, although they take the shape of traditional books, they look like books that you could actually stand up and shelve. What's key is that each opening in the book is this very intensely drawn, and it's sort of a deep image. It's like a stained glass window. The more you stare at them, the more you think about things and think about meaning. And so as you see tonight, I think from his talking about, the books are structure, but they also become structures which are happy homes for Tim's art. What's very important about both Tim and Dan's books is their materiality. And so even though you're seeing these two-dimensional pictures, it's the physicality of the books that really is what their content is about. I took a long time to come to this. I kept thinking, oh yeah, it's the writing, that, that's the text, that's what the book is about. But in both cases, I think the arrow is pointing to the substances, and that is really key to the subjects. So it's my pleasure to welcome Tim Ely.
Just working? There we go. That's just perfect. Well, it's lovely to see all of you here tonight. It's a real honor for me to be at the Getty and get an opportunity to talk about something that I have done since I was very, very young. I keep trying to caption this bottom image. I can't tell whether it's Daniel and I in bathrobes or it's when we worked together as gardeners. So, it's just, if somebody has an idea, I'd love to hear it. In the very early 70s, I decided for me, books would be it. And I had a very vague definition in terms of English, but I could really feel it. I knew that making books was going to be about the coolest thing I could ever do. So I began to do an internal study to figure out from my own life, what do I want to see in these books? And I was very interested in images of science. Walter Murch was somebody I'd looked at since I was a child in the Snohomish Public Library. These are images from the covers of Scientific American. And as much as I loved these things as paintings, I couldn't get a grip on the romance and poetry of a carburetor or a calculator. And it just, it was compelling, but it wasn't compelling enough. And so I pushed back and dug a little bit into the history of science, history of art, and I was very quickly dismayed to find that all of the art history books I had kept from college there was not one mention, even in an index, of the word alchemy. It was just nothing. And yet it didn't take a lot of digging to suddenly uncover this parallel universe that had existed for all of my life that was full of images like this. I was trained in college as a printmaker, amongst other things, and so I'm drawn to the late alchemical material that are made up of engravings. And I just loved the fact that these things were mysterious, they were encoded, and that initially I had no clue what I was looking at. And when I look at the conventional paintings that I looked at as an art student, I generally had an understanding of what I was seeing. And when I would look at this, I had no notion. And that, I love things that I don't understand. So I found all of these things, from engravings, woodcuts, this alchemical imagery, to be full of mystery, and as I would begin to dig into it, I'd find it was full of process. I took chemistry in college and high school. I loved to make things. I'll show you a couple places that were sources for my making. But alchemy, as one of the list of things that propelled me into the content of my books, has been an extraordinary thing. And as I was preparing this talk, I was doing a lot of thinking about it, and I realized that for the first 15 years of my thinking about alchemy, I never had anyone to talk to. Until about 1988, 89, I met Daniel, and it was like the lost brother I never had. So I began to dig around in strange sources. I got an NEA grant in 1982 and went to England to study bookbinding. And in the British Library, I found a manuscript, and this is a little image from one page of this, I think a 1780 book, and my name is on this knife blade, which is the knife that I use for gilding. And I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what to hook it to, but it's an interesting thing. It was a lovely, lovely image. So I want to show you a couple images of my studio. It's on the top floor of a house that was completed in 1914 out in the middle of eastern Washington, 20 miles from the Idaho border. And I really befuddled my neighbors. I befuddled the police at first. Some people thought I had a meth lab up there. So I showed them my collection of bones and skulls and leaves and ball bearings, and it kind of settled down, and we all became friends. But, it's troublesome when you're outside, not outside the law, but outside the grid, whatever that means, it raises questions. I collect a lot of pigments. This top shelf is mostly black pigments, blue blacks, red blacks, gray blacks, blacks that I've mined from holes in the earth, rocks that I've tumbled. That nice gray jar at the top is all tumbled material from last summer. I make a lot of devices that I use to transform pages. Alchemy is about transformation. So this device that you see in front here with all the funnels on it is the Dripatron 2000, and it's designed to drip color on as a grid. This is my magnetic drawing board. No tape holds these manuscript pages. There's a piece of sheet metal on the top of the drawing board, and then a couple of mats. And so these things are very mobile. Here's another shot of the Dripatron, and you'll see this end paper a bit later. I have another one that makes drips in a nice big Enzo-like circle. My newest drawing invention is a takeoff on a 19th century perspective machine. I call it a pivot board, and the idea is that I can magnetically attach a drawing to this board that has bits of wood screws and various things sunk below the surface, so I can magnetically hold not only the drawing in place, but little pivots that I can work a straight edge against. So it's like a giant spirograph. And so all my templates now have holes in them, so it's easy to make a spray of lines through some bit of phenomena or color. So to me, and this is a real stretch of the alchemical metaphor, but this is a furnace. And you know, as you dig around on Amazon and other book sources, one of the things that happens with an emergent technology is it dismisses the previous work. So for a long time, in my view, alchemy was dismissed and maligned and thought to be a charlatan science. And so I just wanted to throw this up as one of those examples. If you look up alchemy on Amazon, you'll find books called The Alchemy of Love, The Alchemy of Abundance, The Alchemy of Affection, and it just becomes sort of, it's not balanced. And it's, it's a misuse of a really gorgeous concept. I love apparatus. When I was in early, I think probably junior high, I bought a load of stuff from the scientific supply company, and I had a small chem lab up in the attic. I wasn't as involved as Daniel. I never blew anything up that was too serious, but there was something extremely compelling about glassware. And so in my own work, I rarely make overt drawings of an alchemical object or process. I prefer to obscure them, but this is from a book of Mullings. This book took me 15 years to do, and it's divided into 7 sections. I call them 7 days, and each day is a concept. So I don't remember which day this is from. It looks to be toward the end of the book. It's probably number 5. So it's full of chemistry and abstracted apparatus. This is this would not work for anything. This is an expressive take on what I think of as a really noble form of projection. I wanted to show you a couple of books that are direct references to the alchemical quartet, air, earth, fire, and water. I have made several of these. These are all in the Lilly Library. I call them the secret books of natural philosophy. I'm really interested in dust. I make a lot of sourdough. I'm interested in what flies through the air out in eastern Washington, what is a mold spore, what is farm chemistry. It's a strange occupation, but these are, and this is very hard to explain. In the alchemical process, you can start with a material, you can do something to it, you can boil it, distill it, burn it, dry it out, pulverize it. I see these books as echoing that idea. And so as you move through one of these books, different things begin to happen. And because of the way I build them, we're only seeing the surface visual layer. Below this, before I ever started the visual part of the drawing, there are grids scored, numbers embossed, other little bits of cipher embossed. Before the drawings ever start, there's something else going on. I live in an area that's really rich in mineral and soil deposits, so sometimes I think this one doesn't have it, but I'm able to go back into the scablands of the Palouse and get several pounds of material that can be pulverized and turned into pigment, because really that's all paint is dirt and something that sticks it to something. This is the book on water. Water is just an amazing material. I usually find that I make the book first and then do the research into the material second. I tend to do things backwards. This is that end paper. Can't buy those in stores. So the Book of Water has a lot of crystal drawings in it, microbes. I was very interested in Ernest Haeckel for a while. I was delighted to find some Haeckel books in the exhibition, and I had never seen them before. I did not know he had done any work on crystals. When I was a child in my first science class, one of the I think disturbing images to me was the model of the atom, atoms and molecules as little spheres on sticks. Just didn't seem right. There was something kind of counterintuitive about that as an idea for how the world worked. And I didn't have an alternative, because when you're 9, what do you know? But all the same, at the time I was getting involved in alchemy, I really discovered that I loved the idea of diagramming ideas. And so my grandfather was involved in architecture. I had a great uncle that was an architect. All of these men kind of, I think sort of inspired me with their love of sharp, pointy tools. Density is a book that the binding is, I wanted to show you the binding because there are copper plates embedded in the boards to give it weight. It's surfaced in a really strange copper paint that actually doesn't look like copper. Layers of paint go over that, and the final layer is iron. (088). We talk a lot in alchemy about materials, transforming materials. I don't do lab alchemy in the sense that I have a lab apparatus with something that goes in at one end and comes out the other. This is my furnace, this is my athanor, this is the crucible. I'm interested in taking materials that are germane to a location, are of interest to me personally, and by mixing them with waxes and resins and eggs and anything else that's sticky, animal glue. I love the balance between animals and vegetables, starches and collagens, and how gold can stick to this material. So I gather a lot of sand, soil, debris, ash, bits of wood. I sweep out all the wood shops of friends of mine, and this all becomes an amalgam. And this material then is encrusted onto bindings. But my bindings, because I was trained in England, I still kind of hold to my teacher's demands that I do it right. And so on these surfaces, they begin to resemble the skins of dead reptiles, but at the same time, they're built in what I would like to think is some of the finest of English traditional binding. I think I might be a Victorian at heart. This is the interior of that book. This is 088. And I wanted to hook back to the images of the pivot board. And I was amazed and delighted to find an image very similar to this in the Alchemy show today. That one predates mine by quite a bit of time, but this is a fragment of a page from one of my sketchbooks. So, as a child, the image at the top was where my head was, but I was really lucky that my parents owned a small hardware store, so I had a job from about the time I was 11 or 12. So the hardware store was the place where I was taught to make things. It was a place where I learned to solve problems and deal with everything from the plumbing issues, electricity issues, caulking a hole in the wall, screwing things back together. It was really amazing. And at the time, of course, I completely underestimated its potency. The Snohomish Public Library was the place that I was taught to think. My kindergarten teacher was the librarian, and so at a really young age, I had a library card, and Mrs. Trapp would be waiting in the library just as if it was my second home. So after school, I would go in and tell her that I need something to read, and she said, well, what's it going to be? Pirates? And well, could be pirates, could be what do you got for rockets, and that all went very well for a long time. So, I thought I was destined to be a cowboy, or I thought I was destined to be a hermit, but books and alchemy and science fiction, I was so seduced by this that at times I barely knew what to do. But all of those things led me to becoming a bookbinder, a maker of things, a guitar maker. I have a strong connection between the kitchen and the bindery, so eggs, starch, collagen, animal glue, beef stock has both a role in what I eat and in what I make. And I thought you needed to see my cat. So Dylan's been in the news because of his Nobel Prize. I don't know what's up and current with that, but about 10 years ago, I found this couple of paragraphs in Richard Grossinger's book, The Bardo of Waking Life, and I just connected with Richard. I want to do a project with him, but this couple of paragraphs really speaks to, I think, what Daniel and I have been involved in. Neither one of us have ever had very conventional jobs, but this last paragraph I will just read to you because it really speaks to what goes on. If you give yourself to everything that you adore and want to be, if you do it selflessly and with a generous heart and spirit, willing to embrace creation, risking all, even honor, even love, even happiness, certainly safety, then you get your songs for free. Without any hoops to jump through, ranks to crash, elders to serve, you get there naked and forlorn. I admire this vocation. I think it's the only one. This is where I live. Thank you very much.
Did I forget to say that there's a special bad karma punishment for people who haven't turned their cell phones off? There is. We learned that in the cave temple show, that the Buddha says there's bad karma. So, thank you for telling us that you can't help what you do. That's good. Daniel Kelm is a man of both art and science. He studied chemistry and philosophy. I know myself that a BA in philosophy doesn't exactly take you up the career path quickly. I worked in a delicatessen in Passaic, New Jersey after college. His BA is from the University of Minnesota for his undergrad degree in philosophy and science in chemistry, significantly. In 1978, though, he started his explorations on bookbinding at the University of Minnesota. And from there, in the traditional way, he apprenticed, working with other binders. That's actually how you learn binding. And then he soon opened his now famous Wide Awake Garage. I want you to tell us about the title. I don't know why that has that name. And that's in Western Massachusetts. First it was in Northampton, which is sort of the road up north to New England, to Vermont and New Hampshire. And now he teaches courses in an array of places who are happy to have Dan come and talk to him and teach how you do these amazing bindings that you do. He's probably the premier binder of artist books. As I said, I can always tell a Dan Kelm book. There's a wonderful book by Henrik Drescher called Too Much Bliss, and it has an amazing wire binding. It's about how books are just you're so happy to have books, and it's just too much bliss. There's also another book by Henrik Drescher called When Will the Book Be Done? Which is another question you can ask about books. I think bindings are incredibly important to books because they become both the skeleton, but also they're sort of like the suit of clothes for the book. And so they are the way that the book comes to you and the way that helps you hold the book and open it, find out about its contents. After more than 30 years practicing his art, now Dan is a respected and seasoned binder. I think you must be one of the probably premier binders in the world. I was going to say in North America, but I think it's bigger than that. His designs are structures to hold and give access to books. You're thoughtful, you're clever, but you're practical. That's the good thing. Your bindings work for the content, they reveal the ideas, and they take care that they're comprehensible. They don't obscure the book. What they do is they lead us into the book. So today we saw some structures with pins that you opened, a book object. There are hinges, there are these wire edge binders, but they're all very elegant, minimal, not sort of self-promoting, but they're just their own, they're doing their work. They open, they close, they contain the book, they present the content. About 4 years ago, Daniel came to visit David Braffman, who's the curator of the GRI's Alchemy exhibition, and myself. And surprised, we learned that he's both well-informed and deeply invested and engaged in alchemy. What could be more auspicious and propitious than that? I didn't know that. And so along with Tim, I think he is the perfect complement to both of our alchemy exhibitions, a real-life bookmaker who's going to talk to us about the importance of alchemy to books and vice versa.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. Also, I'd like to thank Kathy Carpenter and Peter Tarkovsky and Nancy Turner for the invitation. And I love talking about this stuff. It's going to be a little bit different than Tim's talk. He and I complement each other perfectly. Rather than doing a lot of surface treatment, I'm more of a sculptor. And I'll talk about poetic science as we get into this. I was a chemist, but first I was a maker. So I always start my talks with this. It goes way back. My dad was a professional photographer, so when he'd see me making things in the backyard, he'd grab his camera and come out and take a shot. My wife loves to point out that even at that age, I had already built myself a lectern. I think that's a ladder. That's the one that's a little bit questionable right there. And I'm not certain that I had good saw technology, given the different lengths of legs there. This may sound a little strange, but I had a really good relationship, really interesting relationship with the trash man who'd pick up every week our garbage out in back of the garage. He would often leave more material than he took away, because he knew that I loved building things. So the garage was really a place for me to materialize my ideas. At about the same time that I was building things out back, I discovered books. And this was one of the first books that was really instrumental in developing my ideas. You can see there are alchemical symbols on it. So at this point, I was, finding out a little bit about alchemy. But it was really chemistry that grabbed my imagination immediately. This book was it was forward-looking. It has both a girl and a boy on the title page, but notice no protective equipment. This was published in 1960, and by the end of the decade, it was a banned book. It was taken off the shelves because it was thought to contain too much potent information for young people. So I read banned books, and I have for much of my life. And this is probably the reason that it was taken off the shelves. This is why I loved this book. I mean, notice they did at least put it in red, that have a bottle of diluted household ammonia on hand. Sniff it if you get too strong a whiff of chlorine, right? Can you imagine kids being told that, or note, perform these experiments out of doors or before an open window, be careful not to breathe fumes. Well, my generation of chemists was still taught to identify compounds by smell. Not by taste. The generation before, it was by taste as well as by smell. I have found old poison labels that have two classifications. One is very poisonous, do not taste, and the other one is poisonous, taste carefully. If you want to identify an acid, they all taste sour, but don't do it at home. But I love this kind of information, and it both was great fun and it got me into a lot of trouble. But I'm here today, so I've made it through. One of the sections of the book was setting up your home laboratory, so of course I set up my home laboratory. My sister wrote at the bottom, inventor, carpenter, scientist, because I had built my own lab table. And one of the experiments that was really instrumental for me was, and I don't know why I did this, but I wanted to make at this age perfume. So to a boy this age, and I was 10 and a half at this point, perfume is made up of anything that smells strongly, right? So Clorox bleach, good perfume material. Hydrochloric acid, another good, strong-smelling material. Well, you know what you get when you put those two together? Chlorine gas, our friend or foe. Well, I filled the basement. This was the basement of the house. My dad had his photographic studio. He was a professional photographer. His portrait studio was in the basement, so I filled the whole basement with gas, filled my lungs with chlorine gas, staggered upstairs, walked around the block a couple of times to clear my lungs, came back, and two important things happened. Well, I got kicked out of the house and my lab, but that was all right. I went down to a friend's basement, and in the early 60s, every chemical supply company had a city desk, and if you were 21 or older, you could walk up to the city desk and they would give you anything you wanted. Mrs. Shear, where I moved my lab to Bob Shear's basement, bought us a pound of potassium cyanide. So chlorine wasn't potent enough. We needed potassium cyanide. I don't know what we were going to do with it. But the other thing that was really instrumental for me, and you know, we're talking about alchemy, and alchemy is about the transformation of materials in a way that predates chemical transformation of materials. But what grabbed me at this point was a friend of my father's who knew a little bit of chemistry wrote the equation with me, helped me understand hydrochloric acid plus sodium hypochlorite, which is Clorox, yielding chlorine gas. So here I've got the memory of the gas in my lungs, I've got the physical experience of it, and the reaction is written on paper. So mind and body. It was the intellect and the physicality of the transformation coming together, and it was thrilling. It was fantastic. It grabbed me. So I went on to study chemistry and then teach chemistry at the University of Minnesota. This lab on the right, now this was 1928. It's from a catalog that I have, laboratory furniture. That's the lab I taught in. I taught organic chemistry, and it hadn't changed in 40 years. So it looked just like that. The fume hoods had been replaced, but the desks were all exactly the same. So I loved that sense of chemistry lab and doing the physical transformations, but after 9 years at college studying chemistry and philosophy, I was living too much in my head. I had gotten out of my body and into my head and was thinking about things too much. I felt a little bit like this enlightenment character, illumination by the light of nature. Well, here's a laboratory, but more theoretical than I wanted. I wanted the physicality, the raw physicality. So this image is more the direction that I wanted to go after I got out of college. And I love the caption, medieval monks and heretics going underground to form a psychedelic subculture. Now, it was the late 60s and the 70s, so it actually fit perfectly. That's me there. Whoops, went too far. So I went on to build furnaces and to do public demonstrations. This is me at Hancock Shaker Village distilling peppermint oil. And I love to do a physical transformation like this and have the public witness it, and then it would start a conversation first about environmental issues. So how do you take things out of the ground, if it's a mineral transformation or plant material, and transform it, use it, and then what do you need to do to put it back into the environment? In chemistry labs, students come in and they only see the row of bottles on the shelves. So they see just the midpoint of the life of that material. They don't know where it's come from, and they don't know where it's going to go after they're done with it. So I like to do it from raw materials, transform the materials, and then talk about how can we safely transform this again to put it back into the environment. And I like this comparison. On the right, Joseph Wright, the alchemist in search of the philosopher's stone discovers phosphorus. Me, the alchemist in search of peppermint oil, discovers how hard it is to run a furnace. You know, it's easy to talk about the transformations. It's really hard to actually affect the transformations In chemistry, you can control temperature, pressure, duration so much easier than you can with the older apparatus, the furnaces, because it was all from experience. It was all first-hand experience. But what about books? Because after I was a chemist, I went right from the chemistry and philosophy departments at the University of Minnesota to the library bindery on campus, because I wanted to make things, and books were the objects that I chose. And Marcia asked me to explain the name, the Wide Awake Garage. Well, my grandfather, whom I really loved when I was a kid, he died when I was 11 years old, but I have great memories of visiting him, staying with him. He'd take me to the Minnesota State Fair every year. I remember his wool pants. I would hang on to the leg so I can remember the feel of that. He had a car garage for a few years in the 1920s called the Wide Awake Garage. And my mother had sent me a photograph of him in the garage, so I named my studio in his honor. And for a while, we thought Tim was going to name his studio something garage. So we were going to have a string of garages across the country that were all making books. At this point, I used the phrase interpretive fine binding to describe what I was doing. I didn't go through art school. I went right from chemistry and academics to making books. So I approached it from a very traditional perspective. I went from Minnesota, the library bindery there, to Boston and worked at Harcourt Bindery. Not associated with Harcourt Brakes, not a publisher, but a bindery that had been founded in Boston in 1900 and still was using the old techniques of leather binding. I was hired as the finisher and the edge gilder, so I was working with gold and then also learning traditional binding structures in leather. It was like a working museum. It was really fun. It was an opportunity to work with gold leaf day in, day out for 4 years. And it's rare to find those opportunities now. So it was great. Actually, the first job that I got when I moved to Boston, I felt like a naive boy from Minnesota moving to the big city. The first job I took was in a place called Tantalus Leathersmith. And it turns out that the owner, this was in Cambridge, the owner had 2 grandmothers that were both bookbinders. And so he wanted a bookbinder on the premises. But I'd walk into the shop and he'd be making these contraptions out of black leather with silver studs all over them. And I'd say, Phil, what are you making? He said, don't ask. Well, he was making SM equipment. So I moved to Cambridge, to Boston, and I got a job in the wrong kind of bindery. So that's what made me feel like a naive boy from the Midwest. I only stayed there for a short while. But when I moved to western part of Massachusetts, this is in East Hampton, an old factory building, and that part of the country is great for studio space because it was the heart of the Industrial Revolution in the U.S., and each town had a different specialty. East Hampton's nickname is Rubber Thread City or Button City. And Sam Williston built this factory. This room is from the 1860s, this part of the building, but the earliest part of the building is 1840s. And it was Rubber Thread City because he worked with Charles Goodyear, who vulcanized rubber in 1839. And in the 1840s, Sam Williston took that vulcanized rubber and figured out how to make elastic fabric. So there's a great history of manufacturing. So I started my studio, which I call the Wide Awake Garage, and it was a place for me to make books, but also to do a lot of teaching. And I love one-on-one teaching. I used the space for getting groups of people together to talk about specific topics, not just bookbinding, but this is Bill Streeter, who is a local binder, and he wrote the book on the copy press. Some of you may have seen it. People call this a bookbinding press, but it's not really a bookbinding press. That was used to make duplicate letters. If you wrote the original letter in an aniline-based ink, you could put it in a copy press with another piece of paper and it would transfer the ink. But it predates, it was a way of making copies that every office, if you look at the movie Gone with the Wind, the lumber, the mill that they started, there's a copy press sitting in one of the scenes in that. Every business had it. And just groups of people get together and start talking about book ideas. So I liked it. As I get older, community has become more and more important. So my space, which is, it was 3,300 square feet, now it's down to about 2,300 square feet. Always bigger than I needed for myself because I always intended to have a community around me in the space to really explore book ideas. And out of those discussions came these 4 perspectives important to my work: personal, historical, aesthetic, and technical. And I always try to integrate each of these into my work. I'm a historian of scientific processes. I love aesthetics, and the technical side, since I was a little kid, has been very important to me. And these 4 perspectives were really started with this photograph that I saw as a kid. You recognize who it is? Eleanor Roosevelt on the left. And do you recognize her? Madam Chiang Kai-shek. So this is 1943. They're at the White House. My dad worked for Backrack Studios in D.C. and had clearance to go and do photography at the White House. So he took this photograph, and he was there specifically to photograph Madam Chiang Kai-shek, but while she was being interviewed, he had a 5-minute conversation with Eleanor Roosevelt, and then suggested that the two first ladies pose together. And so Eleanor Roosevelt is kneeling on the lawn, on the grass. So my father had a personal experience that he shared with me. So he told me a story about it. This was a historical moment in the world's history. 1943, the war is on. Chiang Kai-shek and FDR are talking about the war. There's an aesthetic to this, the composition of the photograph, and I fell in love with chemistry, aside from the chlorine gas incident, watching my dad develop black and white prints in the darkroom. So, the personal, the historical, the aesthetic, and the technical. So when I would look at this, and this hung in his studio, I knew it was important to me. I didn't know quite why it was important to me until I had thought about it a lot, and those 4 points came together. So I expanded my ideas about book arts and what I was trying to do, and wrote an artist statement. This is an excerpt from it. A book is most successful at telling a story when all components work together towards a single effect. So why is it that we expect words and images to be used to artistic purpose, but rarely demand the same of the binding? To many, the binding provides at most an additional surface on which to compose visual elements. This strikes me as a lost opportunity. The deep, expressive qualities of a binding are to be found not just on its surface, but in its form, material, and movement. When these come together to support the text and imagery, there's a synergistic effect, and the impact can be potent. So I consider myself a sculptor, really. I started making codex structures because I wanted to look at the tradition of book arts, but these, in early codex books like this, were the ones that first inspired me. I love the icon on the cover. There were mostly liturgical texts. There were sculptural covers. I couldn't read the book because I didn't read Latin, but there was a power behind these books. They were in a special place in the church. They were revered. There was something very potent about it. So when I started doing artist books in the codex form, I started playing with sculptural covers. And of course, there is a long tradition of sculptural covers, but I would play with, this was a small edition that I did with Al Robinson, who's the proprietor and illustrator of Chalonidai Press, also in East Hampton. It was his D.H. Lawrence poems, Tortoises. And in the poetry, Lawrence talks about the young tortoise burrowing up through the sand, carrying the burden of the cross on its back, marching off past his mother, not even recognizing her, to take on the world. So I started playing with sculptural covers, but I ran into resistance. Leonard Baskin, who also lived in this area and had Gehenna Press, I can remember in a lecture that he gave at Wellesley College, he said, when you put a sculpture on the cover of a book, it stops being a book. And I had just started doing this stuff, and I really respected Leonard Baskin. I loved his art. But I stood up back of the audience and I said, Mr. Baskin, I want to challenge that. And I said, if the book has a sculpture on it, it adds to the tactile experience of the book. Remember, I'm physically oriented, so I wanted to feel the book in my hands, and you can feel the sculpture. If it still functions properly, then you only gain. It doesn't take anything away. And I've never heard or seen Leonard do this. He's passed now, but I never heard him do it again. But he hit himself on the head, and he said, that hits me on the head, and he recanted his statement. So I sat down really quick and didn't say anything else. I thought, okay, that's a gain, and I'll just take it. I'll take that. But I love the sculptural side, and I started again with the codex structure, but always thinking about how to modify it. So this is a single copy of the Arian Press Moby Dick, illustrated by Barry Moser, who's also a neighbor in the Connecticut River Valley. So I took his image of the whale, used it on the cover, but the thing that I would point out here is that there are no kettle stitches. So if you know traditional binding, the kettle stitch is where the thread emerges from a section, goes into the next section, and then goes all along the inside of the spine. Well, without a spine lining, and I wanted to leave the sewing supports exposed because it has a nautical theme, and this reflects that. So I had to invent a new style of binding, and this is one of the places where wire edge comes into play. So rather than the, whoops, let's go back to that. Yep. Rather than the thread emerging there and then going all along the inside, there's a stainless steel wire that runs on the inside of the section, and each one of these sewing supports has a designated linen thread. So the thread comes out, goes around the sewing support, and then into the next section, around the wire, and then straight back out the hole, and then on to the next section. So that eliminates the weak point of the binding, which is the kettle stitch, which means that I didn't have to put a lining on the spine, and it makes for a very flexible opening. So because I was into science and chemistry early on, I brought my experimentation that I loved there to the structure. And then I started doing artist books that there's no differentiation between cover and interior. So Mars was one of the editions. I did a lot of books, and Tim and I will show you some of our collaborations, books that explored alchemical themes. So Mars is the god of war, associated with iron. So this book is a sculptural book that, when you pin it all together, forms a dodecahedron, 12-sided polyhedral shape, and each facet is made of a pentagonal shape. Now, the Pentagon in DC, of course, is associated with our military. Mars is the root of martial, meaning military. So there's that association, but I had found a very old association of the Pentagon, the pentagonal shape, with Mars. And I'd like to put objects in, oops, I keep hitting the wrong button, sorry about that. Let's go back. I like to put physical objects in with the book, and I call that the three faces of Mars. There's military Mars, that's a sandcast canister ball from a Civil War battlefield, so that would have been shot as a cluster shot from a cannon. There's scientific Mars, a chrome steel ball bearing. I always think of that as Mars with his Sunday going to church outfit on. Much more spherical and shiny. But then there's celestial Mars, an iron nickel meteorite from a strewn field in Namibia. Now this is an edition of 15 copies, so I had to find 15 meteorites all about the same size. So I found a place in New Haven that specialized in meteorites and called, and it was an interesting conversation when I said I needed 15 meteorites all about the same size and explained what I was doing. And I like this meteorite and all 15 that I use. You can see that they have depressions in the surface. That's called a regmaglyphed edge. And it's as though you pressed your thumb into it. That indicates that this fragment flew through the atmosphere on its own. So the meteorite probably shattered high in the atmosphere, and then all these fragments. And in this strewn field in Namibia of about 30 by 60 kilometers, they found tens of thousands of these fragments, which would have been a spectacular rain of hot metal coming through the atmosphere. So that's Mars coming down. I borrow alchemical imagery for a lot of my books. Michael Mayer published this book, Emblemata Nova, in 1817. These images are from the 1617, and these are from the 1618 edition. I call my copy, my artist's book, Neo Emblemata Nova, combining the Greek and the Latin. But whenever I make an artist's book, I like the structure to reflect the content of the book. So this book is a Mobius strip. So one-sided, mathematically a one-sided object, and it forms a ring, and you can hold the book in between two hands, and you can go through each image, and you'll come back to the starting point having seen the images on both sides of the page. So you never have to turn it over. I've done 2 editions of these. Ann Anninger, when she was the curator at the Houghton Library at Harvard, bought one and called me up one day and said, Dan, you've got to make a video of how to put the thing back in the box, because our patrons are having a hard time doing that. And, you know, I told her, I said, this is intentional. Now, the second edition, I put a little description in cryptic language in the box. But alchemy is you had to be mentored to learn alchemy. It wasn't written out. These emblem books are as far as they would go. Each one of these 50 emblems that Michael Mayer put in the book is an alchemical process. And so I wanted to use a structure that was unusual because it reflected the content. But then, in a way, it's fine that it's difficult to put it away. I did put a written description, but again, cryptic, in the second edition that I've done. This image is, there's a gray wolf devouring a king, and then in the background a bonfire and the king emerging. This is the emblem for cupellation, which is a very old metallurgical process. It's the purification of gold. And whenever you see a king in an alchemical image, it represents the male principle and the sun is associated with gold. So the fallen king is impure gold. The gray wolf can be lead or antimony. When I physicalize this, the gray wolf is lead. So if you come to tomorrow's demonstration, I'm going to show you a short video of this process. I've built a furnace and have done cupellation. But here in the foreground, we've got the gray wolf devouring the king. So you wrap the impure gold with lead, and you put it into the furnace, which is represented by the bonfire here, and the rejuvenated king emerges from the fire. So pure gold will come out. So here's the furnace. There's the cupel. So you put drossy material into the cupel, heat it at red heat for about 30 minutes, and when you pull it out, all the drossy material has been absorbed into the thick-bodied cupel, and there's just a little bead of precious metal sitting in the middle of the cupel. That's the rejuvenated king. There's a lot of wonderful mythology that can be performed physically to really enliven the mythology itself. It's no longer just a story, but you can see the story physicalized. So Tim and I started doing books together a long time. This is one of our collaborations called Rubius. And Tim and I met the first time at the Watson Library at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. We were both in a show there, book arts show, and we were standing next to each other admiring our own books. So I'm looking at my book, Tim is looking at his book, and all of a sudden we kind of look at each other's books, and then we look at each other and we go, oh, hi there, and we started talking, and we pretty quickly realized that we were both interested in alchemy. And as Tim would say, and Bob's your uncle. And we just kept on going. We really resonated quickly and started doing a lot of collaborations together. So I'm going to show you a couple of those. This is a book called Air. We did a series of 4 books called Alchemical Investigations, and we did one for each of the elements. So Air, with the 4 elements, and in the process towards the Philosopher's Stone, or the powder of projection, there's a black phase, a white phase, a yellow phase, and a red phase. And that's the earth, water, air, and fire correspondence. So in this particular one, which is the only book that I've done that doesn't have permanent hinging, so you can see there are square panels and equilateral panels. They come out of the box, and then there's a quiver with pins. Marcia mentioned wire edge binding, and that's something that I started developing maybe 25 or 30 years ago, and have done many variations with it. And it allowed me to break out of doing codex books to do accordions, which I call articulated sculpture. So the square panels can be put together into a cube, and the equilateral triangles can be put together into a octahedron. And one thing that I love about the collaborations with Tim, our books, which are geometrical in form, often remind me of maps or globes for alien worlds. And within, there's minimal words or minimal text that can be read directly, but we always give clues. So here's a mapping of another way of laying out the parts. So here it is pinned together, and then the completed piece, so a cube octahedron. And on my own, I do books often without any words in them. And often I start them and then intend to put words on them, but I've made this one, which I call Religio Mathematica, and that's a plank of, I was visiting binderies in England in the early 90s, and went to a bindery in the south of England, and they had just cut down what they described as a 1,000-year-old yew tree in the cemetery behind the abbey. And they offered me a plank. So I carried back on the plane this 6-foot plank of yew wood. And fortunately, I had taken the live bark off, so there was a live edge. But they let me through customs with this piece of wood, and I had one of the woodworkers make this box for me. And at the time that I was working on this, I was listening to Bill Moyer's interview with Joseph Campbell, and he was talking about the word ligament and religion having the same root. It was a connective, a connection. And because the wire edge binding, I thought, well, that's a good name for this. So Religio Mathematica. It's the strong geometry of the cube rising out of that live edge. And again, I would take this to parties. I didn't put words on it at first because I wanted to see if the structure of the book could tell the story. And I would take this and let people play with it, and they would find a lot of different shapes. I call this one the 3 guardians. And then this is the lotus position. And the nice thing about these books without words is that they engage people the way toys engage people, and they would play with it, and they would start telling their own stories. If they're really into it and playing with it, all of a sudden they would look up and start telling a story of their own. And I started looking at them as devices for people to discover their own stories. And almost 10 years ago, 9 years ago, I had a show at Smith College. And poetic science is the name of the show, and it's the phrase that I coined to talk about how I bring art and science together, because when I talk about the work in alchemical terms, sometimes I'll be pigeonholed as someone that wants to go back 400 or 500 years, and that's not the case at all. I look at alchemy as a way of looking at the world that doesn't separate us from what we're observing in science. And again, I'm a chemist and I love the objectification of material through chemistry, but I'm more tuned into an intimate connection. I see us all embedded in the matrix, if you'd like, of the material world. And especially with books, it's a subjective experience. It's a personal experience. So poetic science seemed to me to express more accurately what I was trying to do, or what I am trying to do, rather than alchemy. My friends started giving me pointed hats, sorcerer hats, and I thought, I need to come up with a different phrase. And you can see some of the collaborations with Tim. I showed you air, this one's earth. There's Rubius sitting over there, and then this is Venus. And I'd collaborate with a lot of people because it's always fun to see where the collaboration will go. It always ends up going someplace different than it would go on my own. So that's the last slide. Thank you. Okay.
Well, I think you can all see, I hope, how their artwork continues the tradition of illuminated manuscripts. That's how I see it. So that's why I wanted to see the two of them here. But
So that's exactly what I want to ask you about. Is it was interesting to talk with Tim, to hear you talking in the manuscripts gallery. I'd like to hear from both of you how you think of your connections. It's different, we know, when the way they were working, but there might be some similarities as well. How you think of yourself is related to the people who painted the books and the people who bound the books.
So say a little bit more. What's the focus of your question there?
Just what the similarities are between your work with books now.
And the work that's in the gallery.
Yeah.
Well, we're exploring things. I mean, alchemy, people talk about alchemy as a obsolete art, or an obsolete, Tim was talking in his presentation about definitions of alchemy, and I did a study of dictionary definitions, and the one that I really liked the most was alchemy is an imaginary science. Well, that was meant to be derogatory of alchemy, but I think it's really beautiful. It is an imaginary science. It's a way of looking at the world in a very imaginative way. Now, people say, well, they never made gold out of lead. And it's because you can make gold out of lead, but it's a nuclear reaction, not a chemical reaction. And when you do make gold out of lead, it costs a lot more than if you just go out and find some gold. So it's not a money-making deal, but it was a different realm. And the alchemists were looking at materials and trying to understand them. And, they used what they knew, what they perceived of the world in a way that drew on their experience. So when I look at the materials in the books, in the galleries, I think they're honest explorations of the world around them. And I do that myself. I'm looking at the world around, and we have a different context now to look at the world, and I studied chemistry, so I think in terms of chemistry, but I actually really appreciate the intimate connection that the artists that made the books that are in the show felt to their environment. I feel like, people say now, well, we have perfect control of our use of the environment. Well, if that's true, we wouldn't have pollution the way that we have now. How well has that worked for us? And I actually attribute much of that to the objectification of how we perceive the environment through science, where the alchemists were intimately connected to the environment. They looked at everything around them as reflections of and extensions of their own internal processes. And that's why I resonate with alchemy. I gave up on the concept of cause and effect and control a long time ago. I invite things to happen. And the alchemists invited things to happen. They wanted to make things happen, but they couldn't make it happen because they didn't have that kind of control. I like to live my life through invitation rather than an attempted control.
I feel like when you're doing your drawing, that sometimes you're analyzing and taking things apart and thinking of other ways to diagram, but not in a straightforward way.
Yes. To actually reconnect to your first question about the relationship to manuscript books, I think of myself as working in a pre-Gutenberg technology. And as we began to put all of this together, I decided to pull out a handful of alchemical texts and pop science books on alchemy. And I'm not clear if this realization is solid, but it occurred to me that those alchemists, those workers, those material contact people were trying to answer the same questions either we've always asked or we're continuing to ask today is, why are we here? What's our role? What's the deal? What are these materials around us? I was thinking about travel at that time, how difficult it was to move from, say, northern Italy to England, how long it would take. So information between alchemists was probably sketchy, extremely slow, and yet I kept thinking, well, they are communicating, they are having conversations like Daniel and I've had for 20-some years, and we will talk about alchemy, we'll talk about our work, but then we kind of ultimately get to a place where we say, how are you doing? What's going on? And so it will involute for a moment, and then it convolutes, and ideas get bigger, they get smaller, and it always seems to come back to how do we take this idea and how do we transform it? And the technology that was available to those people is very similar to the technologies that were available to pre-Gutenberg bookmakers. You had a limited amount limited number of tools. The processes were gorgeous, but they were small. A person could actually learn in a lifetime how to do this stuff. And so I see this connection between the manuscript book and the alchemist, and in this show it really brought it home because these objects have this gestalt that they seem to flutter like birds. They seem to be alive, and alchemy seems to be alive to me, and that when science kind of moved in on the game and said measurement, temperature, pressure, these are the things that matter, we lost the poetry. And the poetry is really potent in this stuff, but you have to take a little bit of time, and in my case, I have to open my eyes, I have to look very hard, and I have to have a conversation.
Or not.
Or not. Sometimes we get very quiet.
Do you have more, or do you want to take questions?
Well, I really loved hearing from you both, but hearing from Dan about your interest in the functionality of the book, and how you kind of left the codex behind, because I might dare, like you did to Leonard Baskin to say that actually the medieval binder was always thinking of the whole action of the book with the wooden board and the clasp and the spring action as it would be open if it was done well. So I wondered, your binding training was modern trade, fine binding, trade binding. Did you look into like the early medieval binding styles to bring you to catapult far away into the wire edge structure idea?
Well, I did have an experience while I was at Harcourt. Sam Ellenport, who is the proprietor of Harcourt, had a school there and would invite instructors from all over the world. And Bernard Middleton came and taught us a lot about traditional European binding. Though it took a while for Sam to let Bernard come into the shop, because Sam knew that he was going to influence us and we'd want to try different structures. But I think the most compelling conversation was a workshop. Gary Frost came to do a workshop at Harcourt and had medieval bindings with him, which, as you said, with the heavy wooden boards, you'd open the book and the pages fly up immediately. But in a Victorian-style leather binding, when you open the cover, the ideal is that the text block stays solid, that only the cover moves. And Gary's point was, if the pages fly up, that means that the stress in the covering material is being shared, it's not focused at the hinge, and you know how many leather bindings just break at the hinge. It's actually transferred into the text block, and that's what makes the pages fly up. Well, Joe Newman, who was the foreman at Harcourt, said, but that doesn't protect the book. It opens it up. And Gary said, but it protects the integrity of the leather. And Joe was a great proponent of the European style, French style binding, where nothing would open up. And he'd say, when I open, well, maybe that was a little bit of an overstatement, but
It's not harsh.
where the cover opens and nothing else opens. And he said that protects the book because the book stays solid. And so there was this great argument, a give and take back and forth. I mean, because the joint breaks so much in that style of book, especially French books where the leather is thinned down to very thin leather, Gary said, but then the joint will break, and then Joe said, but then you reback the book, and it just went back and forth. And I realized at that point that there were a lot of ways of looking at this, and that there was there's never one way of doing it, but as long as you can have an argument back and forth and you can evaluate the difference between them. And I tended to go more towards the flexibility that Gary was talking about rather than the compact text that Joe Newman was talking about. So that was eye-opening to me. And I always tell my students, I think there's only been one question that a student has asked me that I couldn't give a reason why I preferred one way or the other. And I say, if you're studying with someone and they say, do it this way, and you ask them, why do it that way, and they just say, because that's the way I was shown it, don't believe it. I mean, explore. Look at things for yourself. Learn the different structures, but then also learn how to evaluate them, how to look at them and evaluate them. And that conversation between Gary and Joe was eye-opening for me that way.
I have a really big picture question for you. Do you think that in what you're doing now, this is in maybe contradiction to medieval or Renaissance books, which had specific content, and so they were illuminating or illustrating, but there was content, it was biblical or it was myth or legends. Do you think you're recasting what a book is now? Making a really different kind of book?
Is this for him?
It's an open.
Handing it over to me too.
Yeah. I mean, we have this almost unbroken tradition, so I think there's a really strong link. For me, I noticed Gutenberg as a pivot point for when the industrial world began. So I really love to think of myself as being pre-Gutenberg because of the fact that I make one book at a time, and I love to lavish the materials in that one book rather than try to contemplate a way to make a number of them. I really can't. So for me, there is this really strong thread back to the medieval book, the medieval image, but I don't want to make the medieval image. That's been handled. That was a really different way to think. When I think about the late Middle Ages, nobody was writing books about hydrostatics and moving water around. It was all theology and commentary. And when we finally get to the alchemical books that I saw today, thinking expanded. And I really like to riff off of that. I love books that are large containers of ideas. I'm passionately in love with information I don't understand. So when I confront that book in Latin that I can't read, I get to read it visually. I get to respond to it without actually understanding or trying to do a personal translation of what is being said or written or printed. So every time I also see a medieval book, I notice that these problems, the flexibility, they're beefy, the boards are thick, they often have to be held open with ribbons. They want to close themselves. A lot of those Victorian books were just mousetraps, and you could literally lose a hand in them. And so as I studied bookbinding, these same kind of give and take stories, they were full of opinions. My 3 teachers basically hated each other. And if I did something the way David taught me, then Daphne would go, that's absolutely improper. That's a vile trade practice. And I still use vile trade practice when I talk to my students because this was just this bizarre phrase. The so-called fine binders hated trade binders. And I thought, well, this is bizarre because if all the fine binders tried to produce enough books for us to read, we wouldn't have any. We need trade binders to produce. So I now come to think that I have one foot in Victorian England and one foot somewhere back in pre-Gutenberg.
1200.
And it's just this really nice but oddball balance. And it may have given me a career.
Yeah. Dan, do you want to talk about? I think you really are. You're making books without words, but with a lot of content.
Well, the content is physical, and that's why and also it's meant, as I said, to be a device for people to discover their own stories. I look at books as a device for storytelling, and you can put the text in, or you can let people discover a story just through the physical contact with the book. But because I don't put words in many of my artist books, I mentioned it earlier, I get heckled sometimes from the audience. So feel free to heckle. I enjoy that. Because, to purists who would consider a book just a codex with words and illustration, my articulated sculpture don't appear to be books. And, we used to kid that, of course they're books, they're sold by book dealers, so they have to be books. But I really look at them as sculpture with a book reference.
But they can be read.
They can be read, they're just read differently. They're more like Braille books, I guess. Yeah, they're read tactily, yes.
The U-Wood box, when I haven't seen that book for a long time, the surface became a star map for me.
Cool, Tim.
Cool, yeah. Yeah, I didn't see that coming.
So I think we want to open it up to questions now. There are microphones available if you'd like to ask.
Hi, I'd like to hear you describe a little bit of your personal experience of alchemy as you're developing your book ideas. Can you say a little bit, each of you, about what that feels like in terms of your love for alchemy, in terms of which dynamic beings maybe come through the process?
Sure. Well, I talked about the great chlorine cloud experiment. For me, that was, because I was breathing the gas, there was a physical experience. And so for me, alchemy and chemistry, chemistry, because it is so theoretical, does take me up into my head. I can think about reactions, but alchemy for me is really physical. So I love the physicality of the book. I love the story that can be told or supported through the physicality of the book. And so I do the furnace work in order to really explore the physical nature of materials. I love what Jung has done with spiritual alchemy, using alchemy in dream interpretation, but he didn't do any furnace work, so he really missed out on that unique experience of trying to do the physical transformations. So for me, I do the furnace work in order to really tune in to the physicality of the material. And when I was a philosopher at the University of Minnesota, I wrote a lot of papers about this material, the stuff of our world. And that for me, see, I'm an animist. I wouldn't, my parents were Lutheran, they raised me Lutheran, but I wouldn't consider myself Lutheran. I'm an animist. I see living spirit in all material, and that's why I like making things, because that intimate contact with the material opens a huge reservoir of energy that I can draw from. It's a dialogue with the material. And the alchemists were doing that. It was more of a conversation. So I like to talk with the material. I guess I can say that.
That's actually what I was asking about.
Okay, good. Yeah, so it's a dialogue. I mean, it sounds a little weird in a way, but as artists, that's what we do. We're using material. We're touching material. If I'm feeling ill, I love making things, because as long as I stay grounded, if I'm really grounded and open to my environment, I can gain energy through contact with the environment, and it helps me heal. So that, to me, is an alchemical way of approaching the world and how I am in the world.
Everything he said, yes. I think of myself as an observer, and as I touch things, I want to figure out what the connection is. I want to know, as an artist, what my materials are. I also love the alchemical idea of transformation. So something goes from being a piece of burned material that becomes a drawing tool, or it becomes an observation that a cooked chicken bone or a beef bone is sticky, and so that I've just released some glue onto my fingers, and I can do something with that. And or we were talking the last couple of days a lot about eggs and the properties of working in the kitchen with an egg, or working in the bindery with an egg to stick gold to paper. And so I just always see these things as a way of engaging the world and paying attention to it, that all this material stuff sometimes seems to be the fossil record of energy. And so I too get energy by conversing, if you will. I don't converse out loud, do you?
No, I talk to
Okay,
it, sure.
no, I'm pretty quiet because people look at you funny. So
Tim will talk to you later.
later,
believe me,
yeah.
yes.
I talk to my guitars, I talk to paint, I talk a lot to paper. I talk to myself because I'm made of the same stuff. Alchemy is almost romance that way, that you can really have a very close, almost intimate, almost personal conversation by getting to know a piece of wood, like the yew wood. We talked about that piece of yew that you brought back for quite a long time, and there was a lot of, you thought about it for some time before it was finally made into a box. So like, what are we going to do with this? And I wish I'd saved some sawdust from that. But
I probably have it
you
somewhere in the
probably
studio.
do, yeah.
Yeah.
We don't throw things away.
No.
I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I wanted to just suggest that Jung
Sure.
So I see the same dialogue happening. I was really curious, so that does explain.
Right, and Tim, you talk about knowing, but it's a body knowing half of the time too. It's not just in the head.
It's felt sensation.
Yeah, and you're into mystery. I mean, we don't have to know everything. We don't have to understand it intellectually. It's interesting to do that, and you can talk about it and pass it on maybe in a different way if you're teaching. But so much of what we do, because we're building things, making things with our bodies, it's a body memory. And I think, it's interesting that the head thinks that it's in charge. Well, I do a lot of things to keep my head occupied while my body is making books sometimes. Because sometimes the head, which moves at the ideas move at the speed of electrical impulses very fast, but physical transformation takes time. So the body needs to really work at a slower pace. And the analogy that I often use is in finance. When we were on the gold standard, our financial system moved very slowly because it was anchored to physical material, gold at Fort Knox and elsewhere. But when we transferred to electronic basis for our financial system, it can move much more quickly, but it can crash and burn as quickly as it soars, So we may move more quickly, but it's not grounded the way that our finances were when it was based on gold, a physical material.
I have a question. I'm curious, I felt like something was a little bit missing in terms of the scope of production, the quantity of pieces, and whether or not there's a collector market waiting with great interest for the next item that comes from you. So, I understand you teach. I saw the pictures of Smith College Gallery. What else? How does your work spread out into the world? Who has these objects?
Do you want to address that first?
Nope.
Nope, okay. Well, it spreads slowly out into the world because they're physical objects. So is the crux of your question, how many copies and how does it get out into the world? Yeah.
What's the interest level?
Well, the interest level is, it varies up and down, I can remember back in the 80s, the New York Times had an article that named books as a collectible item. And then all of a sudden there was a lot of collecting, and then the market really took off. But then early 90s, the first Persian Gulf War, really a lot of galleries closed. And that's when I stopped relying just on doing my own work, and I started making or taking commissions for editions, working with other people, so that I didn't have to worry so much about the monetary side of it. I mean, I don't do this work to get rich. No one in book arts is doing it to, well, maybe you're getting rich, I don't know. But it's really a passion, but we need money. And when I'm an old hippie, so money to me was the root of all evil for a long time. And then I realized that it's really just fuel, and we need fuel to keep things moving. So Tim and I have talked over the years many times about the financial side of this business. And, it's pretty tough. I mean, there's always a way of making it work, but I tell students who come to me that want to have a career in book arts that you should really diversify. Don't you do just one thing. Do lots of things. I started out by doing repair work because there was a lot of that around. But slowly, doing my work, putting it into shows, people would see the work, they'd recognize it, they'd come back and say, I'd like to buy that. So it was really diversifying and doing a range of things. And I'm here, how long have I been doing it? Since 77, I guess, so pushing 40 years. And you saw my studio. I have a nice studio, but I do a lot of teaching. I do a lot of edition work. I work with artists in New York and do my own stuff, but usually that's the slowest stuff to do. It's on the back burner often because I've got to keep the cash flow going. So it's really mixing it up, and you can do it. You can be a book artist and make a living, but it's a hustle, you know, it's a big hustle.
But I think you're being kind of modest, actually, because the books are collected by major, both museums and major libraries who collect things like that. And so their work is in those places. You're not saying that, you should. And then there are private collectors who collect books. It's a blurred field because some of the people who collect are also collecting earlier books and illuminated manuscripts, but then others are just specializing in book arts, and the museums are doing similar things. One of the interesting examples that I've come across lately is a book artist whose name is Gregory Vershbow, and his grandparents were very well-known collectors in sort of around Harvard. I think they were in Newton. And Gregory grew up looking at in his grandparents' library and looking at the manuscripts and looking at their prints and their illustrated books. And then he decided he wanted to make contemporary books himself. One of his first books was called The Alchemist's Tree. And so it's a funny kind of staged photographic work. But there is a collection activity going on here, and it's taken very seriously. I think the difficult thing is displaying the books and showing the whole inside, whereas it's much harder than showing paintings, and that's a difficulty.
Mm-hmm. Well, the style of book that has been collected over my 40-year career has really changed. When I started out, there were bibliophile societies, and they were collecting fine press books. And that was a big thing, and those societies are for the most part gone, and people are now collecting artist books more than fine press books. So there's been a transition. And younger collectors tend towards, at least in my experience, towards artist books rather than fine press books.
I have, yeah, this has been a big conversation for a long time, and my observation has been that if I put a book in front of somebody, they're interested. If they have some money, they buy it. So I've always been able to sell books, but every time I try to think about, well, why is it working? I kind of come up dry because it's sort of like there must be something else going on that doesn't attach to reason and reasonableness, that it's happening because of something else. And I can't define it, but I've never had a job. Well, I had one job. I worked for the phone company for 3 months, and I was a Yellow Pages artist, and I was really good at it, but they wanted me there at 8 o'clock in the morning. They wanted me to stay till 4:30 every day, and it just seems silly. So I decided at the rate they were paying me, I would probably never hit, well, I'd hit $10 an hour by the mid-'80s, and this was in the early 70s, and I thought, well, I don't want to be here that long. So I figured I need to do whatever it is I need to do. I don't have a language definition for that yet, but I know it involves books. And if I can put that focus on that and hold to that and basically never give it up, something will happen. And for a long time, something has always happened.
Well, when we first met, I think you hadn't sold one of your books.
No.
You had a shelf with about 3 feet worth of books on it, and you had made them just for yourself. That was your passion. You wanted to make them for yourself. And then Steve Clay brought Granary to New York, and that's when you started. Sold them all. But then you had to start making books on demand, and you didn't like that much, did you?
So after 1988, I have not had an inventory.
Yeah.
But it always comes back to I'm making a book because what do I want to see? And I'm really lucky in the commissions that I get because people just give me a free hand. They just call me when the book is done, and and what are you working on? And it looks to me like it's a prayer book. I don't know yet, but I'll let you know. And I feel most of the time like I'm an abstract painter in a bookbinder shirt. And so it makes languaging these things very hard. And it always made conversations with accountants and anybody who wants to kind of know, well, what are your projections for the next 6 months? I just look at that as, well, a horrific question. I have no idea, but it'll be fine.
Orthogonal projections.
Yeah, yeah.
So we have time for one more question over there.
Okay.
Howdy.
Hello.
As alchemists, what do you suffer from most? Lead poisoning or mercury poisoning?
I didn't get that.
What do we suffer from most? Oh, yeah, Tim's
dementia.
hearing has gone because of lead poisoning.
Well, yeah, rock and roll bands. I played in a rock and roll band when I was in high school, and boy.
Well, I've always played with lead and mercury, so I don't know which one's going to take me first. But
Okay.
they're both wonderful materials.
But on a more serious side, early on in your career as artist, what did you suffer from personally that perhaps some hurdles you had to overcome?
Say that again, please.
As artists, early on in your career, what were some personal hurdles you had to overcome?
Personal hurdles early in your career?
Oh, well, general self-esteem issues, wondering what in the hell am I doing here today? Why this and not something else? They're almost always emotional. There are always questions or self-motivated questions. If I'm positioned or questioned as to what is this book about, I always end up saying, well, it's not about anything. It might be about everything. They're very, very difficult to explain because people tend to want English. They want explanation. And I love standing inside of the mystery and not knowing. And that's part of the touching, the alchemical observation of picking something up and going, it's sticky and it's sweet smelling, what could this be? And sometimes I don't know what it is, know what it's classified as, but I discover that, I can stick two things together with this. That's a good thing. And so we boil up some more and see what happens.
And for me, it was kind of the opposite. I knew what the sticky stuff was because I'd studied chemistry.
Well, that's why I have him.
No, we complement each other well.
I ask you,
Yeah.
Daniel, I'm trying to stick two pieces of sheet metal together.
Exactly. How do you do it?
How do you do that?
And for me, it was discovering my artistic voice, because I started out, as a chemist early on, and had really looked at the world that way. So it wasn't until I moved to Western Massachusetts and started collaborating with a lot of artists that I was able to discover my own artistic voice. But it was on-the-job training. It wasn't through art school. It was handling the materials, watching how other people worked, and then discovering my voice that way.
Thank you very much.